of things. Anyway, none of these questions are words, you'll know why. Yes, and welcome everyone to this very special evening. Very special to me, because I get to spend some time in the company of one of Australia's best and most cherished writers. Delia, I think you hold that badge now. I've been an unashamed fangirl, of course, since I read the first sentence of that extraordinary novel of yours, that first one, The Service of Clouds. I'm sure everyone here has read it, and if you haven't, go immediately out and buy it. It's an absolute masterclass in writing. But I think I'm just one of an enormous number of people in that fan club, Delia. Since then, there have been 2 more books, The Lost Thoughts of Soldiers, another novel, and the non-fiction biography of a city, Sydney. Both novels were shortlisted for a raft of Australia's most prestigious literary prizes, as was Sydney, which also won the Cal Waverley Library Award for Literature. I'm going to embarrass you here, Delia, because I'm just going to enumerate these things. And her essay, The Opposite of Glamour, which actually appears in this collection we're talking about tonight, won the Walkley Award for Arts Criticism. Delia lives in Sydney, which is why she's not here with us tonight. Well, not because she lives in Sydney, but because we live in Queensland. Where she still teaches creative writing, I think, Delia? Yes.
I do.
You've been doing that for how long now?
Oh, I looked the other day, it's 16 years, I think, at UTS, and longer, since about 1995.
Goodness. Well, yeah. You must be about to get a badge for that, I think. And Delia and her partner have 10-year-old twins.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, whose lives, I think, now and into the future, of course, but might just have informed the urgency and the brilliance of this extraordinary book. So for me, it's been an impatient wait, 10 years, Delia, since the last book. I mean, I can't complain because I take almost as long as well. But what a reward we have for that waiting. Signs and Wonders is itself a wonder. I felt as I read over and over. It's part elegy, part love song, utterly enthralling. It's a compendium of Delia's thoughts and her own emotions and reactions to walking through the world in this era of the great uncertainties, I suppose. It's about many other things that we're going to talk about, but I'm going to ask Delia to perhaps give us a little taste of the writing by reading a little section at the beginning, I think it is, Delia.
Yeah, it's the beginning of Signs and Wonders, and thank you for that introduction. Honestly, it's too much.
Not at all.
Yeah, I'm beaming in from the unceded Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation as well, which is where much of this book is set as well, and pay my respects as well to elders past, present, and future. So this is the beginning of Signs and Wonders. I've lived near the harbour for 20 years. In autumn, I watch fish fry in the water and the swifts that wheel like tiny warplanes above the naval dockyards. In summer, migratory koalas call out from the trees in my local park with a grinding yearning. There have been surprises over the years, a fairy penguin off the end of the point, and once a large stingray gliding up the middle of the canal on a high tide. But mostly I'm looking for familiar creatures, the microbats that flit at dusk over the water, or the flying foxes that land heavily in the Moreton Bay figs, though their numbers have declined and their squabbling in the tree outside our apartment no longer keeps us awake at night. Walking to Mrs. Buckhorry's chair in the domain, I like to scan the small bay in Woolloomooloo for fish. But one day in 2018, there was nothing to see in the flat green water, not even the usual mullet that nose around the marina's floating pontoons, or the ubiquitous smooth toadfish with fins like tiny propellers. A few years earlier, I would have put this down to the seasonal variation of schools in the harbour. But this time it felt different. I found myself wondering if there were no longer any fish to see. What if they were disappearing, I wondered, like the small frogs that were such a common sight after rain when I was a child, or the greengrass cicadas we used to catch in the school playground. In 2014, the World Wildlife Fund had released a widely circulated report which concluded that we had killed off more than half of the world's wildlife. over the last half century, not only exotic animals, but common creatures like giraffes, bats, and even insects. That afternoon in Woolloomooloo, I realised I'd been ticking off checklists of animals on my walks to counter a growing sense of loss. These days, everything seems to carry a terrible symbolic weight of potential catastrophic absence. I'll leave it there.
There's a little taste. I know you'll all be rushing out to buy several copies. Thank you, Delia. It's so, for me, the book is about our very precarious earth, but it's also about language and loss, and about having a language for that loss, and about beauty and destruction, I guess. It's about birds and imagination. It's about children and inheritance, what they would inherit in the earth, I mean. It's about paragraphs. It's about love, and it's about noticing, and the dangerous ways of humans, I think. And you all thought it was about climate change, didn't you? No, it's about all those other things. Can you, I mean, some of the clues were there in that piece you just read, but can you take us to the point where this book began to come together in your head, and what was going on there?
It partly started on that walk where I just, it's just one of those moments where things kind of click, and I found myself thinking, we live in an era of signs and wonders. I thought, what does that mean? I thought, well, part of the problem with these sorts of things when you look at them is that you don't know. You don't know if what you're looking at is something terrible or something, ordinary or something quite wonderful. And so, when I was in Latin classes at school, we'd learn about augurs and haruspices, and so the people who would look at the guts of the heart of a freshly slain ox, or at the movement of birds out of place or animals out of place, and try and tell what the god's intentions were. And I thought, well, this is, here we are, looking at whale, awful videos of whale autopsies full of plastic, which, struck me as being very, very similar. You see dozens of those on YouTube. Where we're looking at pictures of birds with, in one of the remote parts of the world, like Midway Atoll, with, that have, sort of decayed, and their stomachs are left, with these kind of incredible sort of mosaics of plastic left inside them. So it struck me that, they're obviously, in those instances, sort of signs that things are very badly wrong. But you pick up your phone. I'm a terrible phone addict, and you scroll through, and these things just kind of go across, go through your screen. It's like, oh, once in a century hail, big hailstones. But wait, we had one of those, a couple of years ago. And there's, slugs that look like David Bowie, and there's Glockenspiel playing Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, and here's a prehistoric foal, Lenskaya foal, that has appeared after 50,000 years out of melting Arctic permafrost. And there's something about the way that this sort of stuff rushes at us that I really wanted to capture. And part of this for me is just, as you say, our feelings are kind of yet to catch up in a way, because my mother was very concerned about the environment. I read and Dennis magazines, I was addicted to those, the Belgian wildlife documentary maker in Africa. And, I grew up on all that stuff. I've always been worried about it, but it was really only about 2014 when that idea of the Anthropocene, that human activity, not all humans, and it's a controversial term, but fossil fuel addicted humans, activities on Earth had gathered the power of a geological force, that we were entering a new era where all the sort of the stable patterns of the 12,000-year-old sort of Holocene period were all starting to waver and become unpredictable. Even the even ocean currents, are changing. Winds that have gone around the planet for centuries. They're all wavering, and that knowledge, I think, has been so sharp and so swift that we are entering a period that we thought, we're always told, even 10 years ago, it was going to be maybe the end of next century, which is, God knows, soon enough. But suddenly we're thinking, it's here. And I think the other thing that really drove this book, and was the other origin point, was when I went to a conference. It was the first one on the Anthropocene in the humanities. I wear a hat as an academic as well. And Tom Griffiths, the wonderful environmental historian, Australian environmental historian, was showing maps of the Great Acceleration. 24, what are they called? 24 dials on the human dashboard of our use of the earth and effects on it, from deforestation to CO2 in the atmosphere. And the Great Acceleration starts, we see that these things start to go up in about 1950, and they kind of start to go up sort of, more or less like this. And then around about 1990, they all just start to go off scale. And they were so shocking. It's called the sort of hockey stick effect. And I just looked at those, and it was so upsetting and so devastating. And as I researched this book, they stopped in 2010. Those graphs haven't been updated since then. And God forbid what they're going to look like now. But that sense of just acceleration of change, of environmental collapse was so urgent that was really the other thing that drove me to, after, as you say, 10 years and being very occupied with small twin children, to really get this book together.
Yeah, and Tom Griffiths does have a way of, illuminating things, doesn't he? A way that's very gentle, but also it sort of hits you later as you walk away.
Fabulous writing, highly recommended. I mean, he's got the the knowledge and the history as a historian that I do not have.
I don't think any of us have, and it's just his way of approaching. Yeah, it's terrific. Yes, and so you point that out too, that in this very small span of our lifetimes, it is hard to measure. All of this about how fast things are changing and the acceleration. I mean, for me, when I was reading parts of this book, I thought, we look at it. Well, I certainly do. I live in East Brisbane. It's sort of inner city, but it's lots of parkland and lots of trees. And look out the window or stand on the deck and think, nothing much has changed. I get up in the morning and think, the birds there's birds there, and everything's green, and it still rains every now and then. But it's that small context, isn't it? So we could, I think we easily go along thinking, everything's fine, because we're not looking at the wider context of everything until a book like this comes along, or you get lucky and listen to Tom or whatever. So did you feel like there was a window too around you that you every now and then had to unconvince yourself?
Yes and no. I mean, I am sort of probably more, preoccupied by a lot of this stuff. Than I should be. Look, I think maybe. I mean, one of the things about living in Sydney, I guess, is that sense of the 60,000 years of lived history. And, I'm always kind of, I guess I think of that as a city of, flux, that we know that, in the Indigenous people's memories of that this was we lived at the Sydney Harbour was a dry riverbed. And so, I'm kind of, I guess those sort of things are on my mind a bit. But the thing that really, again, really sort of has shocked me out of that feeling of, yes, that's probably just a lovely balmy Indian summer day, nothing to worry about, feels great. You have to have those moments as well. But the fire season of summer 2019 to 20, when all those things that I would have thought were fairly enduring about my city, of course, which I've written a whole book about, the humid air, the southerlies that would come in, all of that, you just see how when those catastrophes come now, it can change on a dime. And there's nothing else to talk about. It's all consuming. And, I just thought, we're on such thin ice, literally, at the moment, that, yeah, I feel much less okay than I think I did before that summer.
Yeah, that reminds me of your little boy's comment on New Year's Eve that you talk about in the book. And I don't want to get all political here, but everything is political now. I mean, I no longer apologise for saying anything that seems remotely political, because it's all political. But I forget where I wrote it down, but you're all stuck inside on a New Year's Eve, aren't you? Can you tell that story? You tell it better than I.
Oh, yeah. It's, I think we have this desire to kind of keep going as normal. I mean, Amitav Ghosh, the Indian writer, American-based Indian writer, said, calls it a great derangement, and that's at the heart of, living today. And so, we'd been having these awful fires. We'd kind of been watching them. I'd actually been up to a conference in Armidale, a couple of months earlier, and I'd kind of seen them starting up there. Yeah. And actually photographed the red sun with a friend, because it looked so amazing. And then, kind of watched them kind of come down the eastern seaboard. And by this stage, it's not that sort of, everything really went up in sort of further down the south coast around about New Year's, but it was looking pretty bad. I mean, the fires had already kind of come around, mega fires had started to come around the whole of the the Warragamba Dam at this sort of point. But my local council decided that they would still go on with their Christmas carols, and I wouldn't let the kids go, and sitting there inside, and they understood why they shouldn't go, because the skies had been run off so brown. And it's just this surreal moment where the fireworks are about to start, and I just looked out, and charred leaves. Now, we're 2 hours drive from the nearest fire in the in inner harbour Sydney, and started to see black charred leaves just fall down, almost as if they'd been kind of, sort of almost like they'd been hit by radiation or something. They'd gone black, but they hadn't had a chance to actually burn, because they'd get sucked up into these mega fires. And and then you heard and then the fireworks went off down in the park. And, at this point, my son, sort of running around kicking the furniture and saying, every Prime Minister. And I said, well, actually, in this case, it's the local council, but it's, very similar. They've made a decision to go ahead with this, while, at this stage, we thought a billion creatures had burned. We hadn't kind of quite got up to the 3 million figures that we got to at the end of it. But it was a decision. And he was running around kicking the furniture, saying, what can I do about this? I'm just a boy of 8,
Extraordinary. The anger, that, and the fury that children have to feel.
I try and not cry tonight. I cried on Chiblalas.
Of course, I was crying reading it. I've got an 8-year-old grandson, and I can see him doing the same thing. And you just have to think, what is it inside them that is allowing them to, to have this reaction? It's clearly.
And you wonder what's changing for them. I mean, they talk about every generation. Part of our issue with being able to sort of see this change is shifting baseline syndrome, that we start with the amount of nature that we already live with. But I wonder, my son also says in the book, that he and his sister have lived through 2 of the most profound events, coronavirus being the other, of their parents' 50-something-year-old lives. And you just think, how is that going to, affect the sort of people that they're going to be? Especially, I love that idea that, we are the sort of people we are because of the other creatures that we're surrounded by. And so people who saw passenger pigeons were fundamentally in some way different to people today who haven't seen them. And so you think, what's their baseline going to be like? What's their future going to be like? But I really worry for that generation. I worry, and I think they're kinder. I think they're more politically attuned, certainly much kinder. But most kids, I think, are born fairly kind and fairly sensible. And they see, my son could see how crazy it was to have fireworks, in the middle of a conflagration that was, consumed about a third of the state at that point.
I just had the thought when you were saying that of course, it's almost, the Great Fires of London, people have lived with plague and fire and all kinds of catastrophe all at the same time. But this is a different moment, isn't it? It's building to some kind of pitch, and that's what you're talking about in the book, isn't it? That there's a balance that's been reached, and it's about to tip in another direction.
Right. You know, my publisher, when we were talking about this book, I quote him, and it says that you know, that it's almost like watching a whale breaching, you know, that there's that moment where it's kind of suspended, and, you know, it's kind of awful and it's beautiful. And this moment's very beautiful. I mean, that's the thing that I wanted to capture, that, you know, it may not be afterwards, you know, perhaps we're in this really Baroque sort of phase, but, you know, one of the things that, you know, has been really striking is, you know, when we weren't in the thick of the smoke, for example, how stunning those, you know, those sunsets were, you know, the color of the skies at that sort of time, the, you know, all the wonders, all the things we're learning about nature at the moment, about the way that, you know, they're almost fairy tale like things, that, you know, trees feed, you know, fallen comrades through sort of rhizomic sort of systems and feed them sugars, or, you know, that, you know, that bioluminescence, you know, is possibly a language, you know, and probably one of the most beautiful and most spoken languages on earth, the language of light. We're learning all these extraordinary things, you know, at the same time, as we've got this incredible, everything is sort of shot through with this feeling of, you know, incredible precarity.
Yeah, there's a lot of irony, isn't there, around, and I'm sure this is one of the things that children are picking up on, which they may not have in other circumstances until they're a bit older. But the irony, in fact, like with COVID, when everyone was locked up, unhappily so, but the small chance, the small window it gave creatures and vegetation and trees to breathe a bit more easily, and how that changed them as well. There's these two, I mean, in the book really shows off these ideas of two contrary things being relevant at the same time.
That's you know, that was the sort of trick in a way to working out how to write it, was just realizing that, you know, I wanted each essay to kind of sit on that kind of fulcrum of, you know, this knife edge between, you know, between beauty and loss. I almost called it Dispatches from a Time of Beauty and Terror, but, you know, I thought perhaps that was just a little bit much for the title. But that was the feeling I wanted to get, was this, you know, this feeling of, but, you know, things being very beautiful at the moment. And, you know, perhaps, you know, being not only obviously being worth holding on to, but perhaps trying to sort of tell us something that we can still listen to.
Yeah, well, you achieved that you very much achieved that that balance, but without whacking us over the head with it, shall I say? It's because you presented it so beautifully. I wanted to talk too about some of the wonders that, I mean, we've talked about, I mean, yeah, and there's lots that I've written down about the signs and all the, and I mean, you might go into some of those a little bit more about the birds with the plastics and microplastics in their bellies, and the whales, of course, and all the other incredibly depressing signs that you talk about. But the wonders as well. Let's talk about some of those, because they're a little bit more cheery. Although before we do, we have to talk about the Bogol Moths.
Okay.
I think, I'm not sure how many people are Brisbane people or Queensland people out there in the audience, but I was saying to Delia before we came on, there's a extraordinarily moving piece in the book about the complete disappearance of Bogong moths. I'd always loved the idea of these moths, even though we don't see them in Queensland. We certainly don't see them fly, but the romance of them, or something, and the way they behave, and their unerring sense of where they're going and what they're doing, and their importance to Aboriginal people, you know, now, well, then, and way back. And you write about them having gone. And I had to read that 2 or 3 times and think, that can't be. Surely that's wrong. How could Bogol Moths be all gone?
You know, they were so you know, they've always been a feature of my life growing up in Sydney. I lived, you know, 10 years in Melbourne, but, you know, I guess maybe about 2007 or 8 would be about the last time that I really remember big flocks of land. And they would come in, they wouldn't come into Sydney every year in big flocks, because they kind of get blown off course, but they're amazing because they are amazing, or they were amazing. I mean, you know, I'm not quite sure what language to use there, but they navigate by the Earth's magnetic field. And that was only discovered, you know, a few years ago. And, you know, and they now do they estivate? I think they estivate. Science isn't my strong side, but basically they, at a certain point in their cycle, they I think they rise in grassland up north, and then they kind of go into clefts in rocks around the Snowy Mountains. And you know, they were so copious that you know, poor things would cluster into the front of Sydney buildings. They, you know, sometimes get blown into Canberra, go into Parliament House, and they were such a extraordinary miracle, a wonder, an absolute wonder. And you know, a couple of years ago, the scientists went looking for them, and I think they couldn't find a single one in all their hiding places where, you know, where they had been tracking and looking at these creatures for years. You know, there could be a return of some sort. It could be that it's but you know, we're starting to look at these mass events, as, you know, that are, you know, including COVID, you know, that are, again, kind of quite extraordinary. So there's really, you know, pretty clear sort of signs, including megafires that haven't just been here, but have been travelling around the globe from, you know, places where the Earth shouldn't burn. You know, Arctic Circle has been having a lot for the last 10 years or so, as well as in Australia. So, you know, these events are becoming bigger. But one of the things I just wanted to look at was the way that, you know, when those, you know, things almost stop becoming metaphorical. So I've kind of got this fascination as a writer with language and culture, and the way that we kind of compute the, you know, the unthinkable. Yeah, so sorry, just like slightly drifted, lost my train of thought there. But
no, I really wanted to get that in, because it also underlined to me how location-specific things can be, and we don't notice. As I hadn't noticed the complete absence of Bogol Moths or their decline, because I'm here, and how much that happens. You know, of course, we know terrible things are happening overseas, great declines in populations, but you know, here we kind of feel like we know what's going on. There's a big drought, or there's a big flood, or there's a big fire, but yeah, unless you're really keeping up with everything that's going on in the natural world in every state or every town, you don't know. And so it's really easy to convince yourself sometimes that things are okay. You know, they're not, you know, that human impulse to shore yourself up, I guess, and feel okay today.
Well, you know, we also live in a universe of sort of, you know, a lot of our time is spent in what I call kind of the world of glamour. And I was really fascinated by that, and just the way that, you know, they're probably, you know, maybe, you know, I write about a big fur seal that turned up, Sylvester. Thought he was doomed, you know, pretty much from the moment that he was given a name. But this big fur seal turned up in, you know, at the end of my street in the park, you know, at the top of the little steps, the tiny beach there.
And he was big, wasn't he?
He was big. He was 200 kilos. Yeah, and you know, I found myself wondering if there are more images of animals that are online. You know, you can always kind of go and find some, you know, sort of nature program where, you know, you can see animals frolicking. In fact, to the point where David Attenborough, you know, there was always that idea that, you know, that we had to have some positive, we had to have what, you know, Jenny Offel calls in her fiction the obligatory note of hope, and you would have that in nature documentaries. And actually that's been a huge change culturally, because you know, people like David Attenborough thought, well, actually, you know, maybe we got wrong, maybe we shouldn't have done that. But, you know, so many of us, you know, are not necessarily reading novels and reading works of essays, but, you know, looking at programs, you know, where you know, that are based on the idea of the makeover and glamour, and that, you know, you can always kind of perfect things, you can always make over a space, you can always find that island somewhere, you know, the romantic, ghastly sort of romantic island, you know, with palm trees and umbrellas and cocktails where everything's all right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we really cling to that.
I love that essay.
World.
And it made me think of this, you know, the suburbs around here that I live in, and people are still somehow in such denial that they keep building those kinds of houses as if they were living on a tropical island. They cover every inch of the ground, so the earth can't breathe there anymore because it's all building, and it's swimming pool, and it's this great denial of.
Part of my, you know, other inclination writing the book, I guess, is that, you know, I write a lot about going down the south coast, which is, you know, my happy place, I suppose, New South Wales, and sorry, I just sort of anyway, I lost that train of thought, but I'll get it's just too easy. My brain sort of just goes everywhere with these topics.
Oh, well, of course, and there's a new book out, so yeah. But I want to take you to the wonders, or get you to take us to the wonders that you talk about in terms of, you know, you'd mentioned them earlier about the long extinct animals emerging from permafrost, which by its very name is meant to be permanent, and it's not, like mammoths. After tens of thousands of years of being there, under Viking sword, you know, being found in the shrinking lake in Sweden. But what about? I really would like you to talk to everyone about the hunger stones, because that really grabbed me.
So in the historic drought of Northern Hemisphere drought of 2018, all sorts of things started to appear out of the rivers, like, you know, old World War II ordnance, and you know, and parch marks were amazing. So, you know, the shapes of old Neolithic villages, the ground was so dry that, you know, suddenly you're just seeing almost as if there'd been an invisible hand writing on the earth. They were a bit like, you know, Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, you know, the shapes of these coming. But one of the ones that really struck me was hunger stones in Dessin, in what's now the Czech Republic, and they say when you that was from a historic low, you know, about the 1400s, 1500s, and it says, when you see me weep on these stones, you know, and they are appearing out of the you know, from an older form of wisdom, I suppose, out of the earth. And so those things, you know, I started collecting them because I found them, you know, I found them so fascinating.
Well, we're seeing them.
But yeah, what I was going to say before I sort of lost my train of thought was that I kind of feel when I go somewhere like the South Coast that, to me, it always feels like, you know, things are there's a bit more, almost a bit more going on. It's actually richer and more interesting, watching, you know, nature go about its own, you know, and those sort of wonders, I suppose, are so hard to see next to all this kind of spectacularly strange and amazing stuff. But, you know, I sort of was interested in looking at, you know, birds and, you know, noticing those sort of things that kind of need maybe a little bit more noticing, because we, you know, are so caught up in, you know, the big signs, the big wonders in our world of glamour, and yet, you know, birds are so much older than we are, and they're, you know, they've been in their modern form, you know, something like 65 million years. You know, you start to see the first sort of modern looking birds when we are still, you know, noctivorous, nocturnal shrews, you know, in little clefts. You know, those, I kind of wanted to, you know, write something that was a bit of a de-glamoring, I guess, as well, by looking at that, you know, looking at all that sort of stuff. So I kind of tried to really balance the big stuff with the, you know, with that small stuff. And I suppose with the measure of my own life, not being a keen autobiographical writer, but, you know, realising that my life is kind of a yardstick for much of the great acceleration. So that's the kind of, you know, it's kind of balance I'm trying to.
Absolutely. And we do wonder what our children's lives are going to be the measure of. It's almost too frightening to think, right at this minute anyway. Goodness, the time is disappearing. I really wanted you to talk, if you would, a little about changes not only to the climate, and you've touched on some of this already, but to our culture. The culture is changing as well with all this, not just, you know, the ambient air temperature, but the actual the temperature of our emotions, you know, in a way, and our relationships and our language and our art. Can you talk a little bit about the way our brains have sort of adapted or changed, and how our emotional makeup has moved?
It was only writing this that I look back on, years and years of reviews and reading, and just thought, actually, things have really been accelerating. I think there's a point around about 2001, where things just suddenly start getting a lot faster. And I was always, and of course, that's around about the same time as 9/11. And there's an article that was just every writer, you, Chris, probably as well, where just, when a week after 9/11, the eminent critic James Wood writes this article and says the modern novel has become, so much of a kind of an entertainment, so full of, essays. And he said all this stuff like Zadie Smith's books, it's hysterical realism, and it is incapable of being able to, it's so overheated to capture what did he call it? But a kind of a monstrosity, this great damage of something like the emotional depths of 9/11. And so that was just such a great moment to be able to go back to in one of the essays, because he is, basically the person freaking out most is James Wood. Yeah. But that word that he came up with, that title, hysterical realism, was actually really captured something. He got the symptoms right. He just didn't get the, get the disease right, which was an Earth getting faster and faster. And so you have people like Jonathan Franzen with the corrections, and people writing these enormous books that do have little mini essays and things in, that are almost trying to kind of capture this world getting faster and bigger, and how do you fit all that sort of speed in? And it's almost like, then the novel kind of goes, it's kind of like this kind of shedding of a skin. And, then we started to, get novels where people going, actually the old form doesn't really fit. So those people were trying to, kind of write a kind of a social realist novel that was going to somehow show the world the way it is. And then you start to get this incredible, exciting sort of shift where, people like James Bradley are stretching the time frames of a novel out over generations, or Chrissy does that in her novel as well. It just that, and that idea of the non-human. I write a little bit about Uncertain Grace and the idea of jellyfish consciousness. There's such beautiful writing there about, and this idea that perhaps stretching the idea of what the human is, or stretching our imaginations to be able to take in the non-human, all these other amazing sort of agencies and consciousnesses that are around us. That, I think that's a really exciting news. One of the trends that I kind of look at in terms of, culture reacting to try and capture different feelings and different speeds to the way that the world works today.
Yeah, I guess that when you look back, the same happened in lots of eras, didn't it? You think of, F. Scott Fitzgerald's writing at the time, at that time in the world, the response to war. The books that come out, they're not particularly about a war, but about suffering or the politics of it.
But I think the shift is moving from the human to thinking about, can characters be non-human, or can we kind of get other sort of aspects of the world beyond just being kind of focused on, well, this is what it means for human beings, which marvelous as they were, people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, wonderful, but that taking fiction for one thing out of the entirely humans are exceptional. Human history is the only sort of history. It's the only sort of story. And now I think there's much more of an interest in sort of non-human storytellers, and really trying to stretch the capacity of what we write about and what we feel, because we have to, because
absolutely.
The changes are so profound.
Books like The Animals in This Country and Peredwin's book, I can't remember the name, but something animals, it's just gone out of my head. But anyway.
Only the Animals.
That's right, yeah. So they're even in the titles of books. So it really does, herald a shift, doesn't it, in how I look.
That's a really exciting one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And you also, I want to squeeze this in before we go to questions. You also talk about paragraphs and how they've changed. It totally appealed to me because, like you, and like some other people I know out there who are listening tonight, learn to type on an old typewriter, and we did the indent.
Yep.
And we went to electric typewriter, we still did the indent, and even with the word processor, we tried to do the indent. But that's changed. It's gone. Can you tell us briefly, I guess, about that? I'm not sure how many questions we've got waiting, but yes.
Yeah, I just became fascinated by the fact that, you know, I was reading stuff where instead of, you know, I grew up, I suppose, on, you know, read a lot of Dickens and, you know, sort of Victorian novels. And, you know, one paragraph kind of leads on to the next with a tiny indent space, which is where the printers once would have put the, in, you know, the decorated capital letters.
Yeah, the little dinkers thing,
you know,
yeah.
Yeah, and then there's sort of, you get these beautiful big kind of building blocks of prose, and they kind of built, but they were progressive, they kind of built from one to the other. And you know, Virginia Woolf says of Hazlitt's writing, it was like the ringing of a hammer on an anvil.
Yes, so beautiful.
Sense of, here's a big solid world, and you know, this is, and the paragraphs kind of reflected that, I think. And then suddenly where, you know, suddenly everything I'm picking up and reading is in these little justified at each end text bricks, little paragraphs. You know, have a little paragraph and then a floating bit of space in between them, maybe with a little dinkus or a little asterisk, something. So, and then another one. And I just kept thinking that's so fascinating because you know, it almost to me seems to capture something maybe about our attention spans. But that's the easy thing to say about it. I think that, you know, the more you kind of think about it, the more there's something about the way that it's a bit like looking at those wonders coming through your phone. There's that thing, and there's that thing, and there's that thing. And it's almost like that writing, for better and worse, has kind of gone, well, maybe things aren't building, you know, in that sort of, to that progress, to that, you know, to these big kind of dependable sort of, you know, sections in novels or in essays. Maybe, you know, following that thread of thought isn't the way to kind of respond to what's happening now. Maybe just having paragraphs, but, you know, sort of text brick space, you know, is a way of capturing something about the way that, you know, we are just living in these sort of flashes of feeling. And that's the thing with this stuff, that it hits you and you just, you know, it's kind of like emotion. And it's hard to feel that kind of, it's almost like as the ground kind of moves beneath our feet, you know, the sort of the solidity of paragraphs and sections in a page sort of shifts as well. So that was the one where I just thought, this is what I think, I'm just going to kind of push the boat out. And
I loved it. I loved
play with that idea.
Say where is it? You said that there may be another way to talk about the floating paragraphs, you call them, that the little isolated blocks of words might be what you call unconscious metaphors for our future isolation. Who would have thought? Paragraphs, it's, yeah, extraordinary. I'm getting the eye from Kristina, which means that we should
we should just call for a couple of questions. I'll go back to you after that if we don't. I know that Sandra had actually asked the paragraph question just before you asked it again, Chris. So we've answered that for you, Sandra Hogan. And I think that's fantastic as well, because there's certainly a weaving that's going on in books at the moment where different ideas are woven together, put next to each other, and they resonate, which is probably the only solution to all of these problems that you're noting, actually, is to look at all of the things at once. But there's a question here from Ashley Hay. And who is also a dear friend of ours, who has said, is there a sign, a wonder, a talisman that you carry with you, Delia? If so, what makes it potent for you and what is it?
Look, it's, you know, I think it's what I wrote about in my birds essay. That was the essay that came last. It was the one that just came out, you know. Some of them were a bit more sort of painful to produce. You know, and for me, it's the presence of birds and the presence of creatures whose, you know, history is not one of sort of straight evolution. Well, I mean, you know, all evolution is kind of complex and tricky, but we've had this kind of sense that, you know, in the way of written history, that it all kind of leads to us and leads to our modern moment. And, you know, I think, you know, birds and dinosaur feathers, you know, for me are the kind of things that I, you know, kept in my mind a lot. Just, you flight was evolved and disappeared at least 4 times in the Earth's history. That the Earth doesn't have to kind of move towards, some sort of goal or, we're so orientated around, human history being sort of so special. And I think just thinking about the fact that, and everything has to kind of have a use and a reason. And the fact that, dinosaurs had feathers and, they didn't have them for flight. They had them probably because they were just very beautiful. I guess they're things that I kind of, I don't know if they're quite talismans, but that I kind of keep in my mind when I think about this stuff.
I have a question actually too. I'm really interested in the future of fiction, particularly since this current moment that we've been living through for the last 2 years, and how difficult it is for writers of contemporary fiction to come to terms with what we're living through at the moment. Do you feel like you have any answers to that question? I'd love if you did.
Look, I think it's happening. I think that like many others, I've had a kind of a crisis of faith in novels as they used to be written, and that's why I admire yours, and I admire the some of the other works like Kieran Dovey's and Jen Mills's writing, where fiction is really it's transforming in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways, and I think it has to. But there's another novel that I have in mind that I really like, which is Reservoir 13, and that's a crime novel, but the human crime is never kind of solved. We just see 10 years evolve in this village that's perched under these big reservoirs, and we kind of watch what happens in the natural world, and watch the sort of the water rats sort of put on weight for around winter and that sort of thing. That kind of goes along hand in hand with that story, which isn't a sort of a mystery story anymore. That sort of fiction really, really intrigues me. And I think that we're just seeing a kind of golden period of fiction. Once we kind of put that idea out of our heads that we need the kind of great Australian novel, or the great American novel, where we kind of got all that idea from in the first place in many ways. I think, look at Richard Powers' Understory and the attempt to kind of write this mighty sort of collection of different pathways, relationships that people have had with trees. You almost kind of couldn't, it's just exploding in so many interesting ways, but the form of the novel is just not that. I don't think you can write those kind of neat novels that James Wood was that sit nicely in their genre and can be nicely unpacked by a critic with a Cambridge degree. I don't think that they are so much the answer now. I think we're kind of moving into a really exciting new era of fiction.
So the answer to fiction and in the age of COVID is to look at the form and to rethink the form. I think that's a great answer. That's the best answer, and I've been asking everybody for 2 years this question. So that's fantastic. Ashley has another question for you, which is, I love your image of living with the flashes of feeling. Do you think one of the reasons you love being on the South Coast is because there's more significant space around or between the flashes?
No, I think that no, it's the opposite, that it's more sort of holistic, I guess, that my feelings are only a small part of what's going on there, that I'm not trapped in it's still, there are pockets, little rainforest pockets, there are bits that are still, I like to take my kids to see, what's still sort of functioning while I can, and these bits did escape the conflagration where we tend to go, in the lyrebirds, running around, whatever. And that sense of being in a place that can still go about its business without you know, obviously humans impinge on all sorts of ways, but without my having to be kind of involved, you know, like actively involved in kind of sort of trying to make meaning, just all that sort of, you know, that web of life, I suppose. So it's an entirely different sort of feeling. It isn't that, I feel like things get knitted back together down there in a way that is very sustaining compared to, you know, living in that world, sort of scrolling through your feed and seeing, you know, seeing things sort of just rushing at you. You know, as David Shields says, you know, reality rushes at us in bright splinters. I don't feel that. I feel it's, you know, it's kind of emanating from a different sort of light source, if you like. And I'm not sort of, you know, and I love that South Coast light, but it's a whole sort of light. Yeah, and it's not sort of anatomized and kind of crazy. Yeah. They're different.
Yeah.
Fantastic. That's all the questions that we had for the audience at the moment, unless there are any final ones that come through. But Chris, I might go back to you for our wrap up. So I've absolutely enjoyed this conversation between the two of you. I think it's, you know, it's something that we need to keep talking about. So I'm glad that your book is out there to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to finish up on something a bit scary, but and a bit away from that last piece you were talking about, Delia. But this one really did make me cry when I read it, and I think it probably isn't something for children, but it is something every adult should be talking about. And that you talk about this thing called the new animism, which and of course Aboriginal people have, you know, understood this forever. And I think that's really interesting in itself, actually, that of course we don't know country the way Aboriginal people know country. How the hell do we save country? We don't know. But anyway, but you know, you talk about, you know, the whole world being sentient really, and soil holds knowledge and rocks feel, and I believe that too. And of course trees communicate. But what really made me cry was when you talked about scientists who were watching icebergs melt, and they were loud as they melted, and they emitted excruciating sounds. And another author you talk about of phonic studies of ice melt says that these are the songs of a changing climate. And I just thought, well, if reading that and imagining that doesn't change the skeptics, I don't know what would. But perhaps it's something we all need to do, is to go and listen.
It's almost unthinkable, but we have to think it, and that's the negative capability. You know, we've got to live. But you know, we've got to hold those ideas together in your mind,
in our heads. I think we should all go and listen to icebergs crying. Thanks so much, Delia. What a pleasure that was. Such a beautiful book, everyone. Look at this gorgeous cover.
It is gorgeous. It's so beautiful.
It really is. Congratulations. It's superb. Go out and buy it, everyone.
And thanks, Chris, for doing such a fantastic job. If people are interested in continuing the important conversations that we've had tonight, we do have the Griffith Review, the next issue of the Griffith Review coming up, and you can join us via Zoom if you're not in Brisbane. So do go on the website and have a look, because I think that's another place where these conversations are happening. The great authors like Delia, like Chris, like Ashley, having these conversations and starting them, and they're also continuing them in these wonderful journals that we are so lucky to have as well. So thank you very, very much, and we'll see you on the flip side.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.